In our film Falsification of Written History, we talked about the global falsification of history using the example of forging ancient written sources and literary works. However, blatant forgeries are not limited to written documents. Many other fake objects of material culture, such as paintings, sculptures, fake religious artifacts, and supposedly ancient artifacts have been mistakenly or intentionally attributed to the world's cultural heritage. Some were intentionally made to look old, while others were simply dated incorrectly. But both types still prevent most of us from forming a correct understanding of human history. The world's largest museums house hundreds of thousands of exhibits. Historians and archaeologists attribute a significant portion of these objects to either the beginning of the Common Era or to the pre-Christian era. Most museum visitors trust the guides, usually without paying attention to the fact that their stories often contradict not only historical facts but even elementary logic. Let's take a fresh look at some well-known historical monuments. Hundreds of sculptural images of great figures of the past have survived to this day. Almost all of them are made at a high artistic level, with beautiful marble, superb sculptural technique, high-quality images, and almost always very good preservation. Looking at them, it is impossible not to notice that they are all made in a single style, although historians date them to different centuries of antiquity. Here is Socrates, here is Zeus, and this is Alexander the Great, Caligula, Charlemagne. In addition, many sculptures depict people with clean-shaven, well-groomed faces, such as the sculptures of Caesar and Nero. But they supposedly lived in extreme antiquity, in the 4th and 5th centuries BC. How did they shave? Iron and steel only appeared in the Middle Ages, and it is quite difficult, if not impossible, to use bronze products for these purposes. However, historians are not at all embarrassed by this fact. They continue to assert that both Nero and Caesar lived before the Common Era. It is interesting, how did the historians determine whose busts and sculptures these were and when they were made? After all, as a rule, they do not have names or dates. Unfortunately, very often one has to realize that most of the dating is based on nothing at all. Historians often just guess whose image it is. For example, let us consider a well-known cameo, known as the Great Cameo of France. It is not just an ordinary cameo, but a famous supposedly ancient work of art. Today we are told that Tiberius and Livia are depicted in the center of the cameo. The man in armor is supposedly Germanicus, and his mother, Antonia, is next to him. In the upper level, the Emperor Augustus is depicted among the assembly of gods. This is probably why this supposedly ancient cameo was once called the apotheosis of Augustus. But the cameo doesn't have any legend attached to it.
So how did specialists determine who exactly is depicted here?
Perhaps they compared the facial features of the people depicted on the cameo with images of specific historical figures? They compared the facial contours, the hairstyle, and the shape of the eyes. But where did they get their authentic images? After all, as we know, no lifetime portraits of ancient rulers have survived. It is possible that after some time, historians will authoritatively declare that this cameo depicts not Tiberius, but, for example, Constantine the Great. Their imagination is not limited. If the origin of even such works as the Great Cameo of France is unknown in the Scaligerian history, then perhaps historians would be better off admitting that there is still much they do not know, rather than pretending to be unquestionable authorities? There is another interesting fact that draws attention to itself. All supposed ancient statues were made with a great knowledge of human anatomy. But the thing is that people acquired this knowledge only in the era of active development of medicine. From the history of anatomy, it is known that the first realistic and detailed description of the human body appeared in 1534. It was a book by the surgeon Andreas Vesalius, on the fabric of the human body in 7 books. Earlier authors had a good idea of the human skeleton, but the location of the muscles was poorly known. This was due to religious prohibitions. It was forbidden to make skeletons and conduct autopsies of the deceased. The use of dead human bodies for studying the structure of the human body became possible only from the 16th century. This was achieved by the anatomists of the Renaissance. They even received permission to conduct public autopsies. For this, the first anatomical theaters were created. Leonardo da Vinci is considered to be the founder of this practice. Initially, he became interested in anatomy as an artist, but later became passionate about it as a scientist and was one of the first to dissect human corpses to study the structure of the human body. It is believed that it was Leonardo's creativity that influenced the writings of Andreas Vesalius. Therefore, only in the 16th century did artists and sculptors have the opportunity to study muscle anatomy. Only by understanding how they are located under the skin did they start depicting the human body realistically. It is not surprising that in the old images from the 11th to 15th centuries, human figures are shown without any delineation of musculature. That is, they are quite conventional.
And now let's look at the ostensibly ancient sculptures.
This statue called Discobolus was supposedly completed in the 5th century BC. How carefully the ancient sculptors conveyed all the details of the structure of the human body. It is obvious that they already knew the location of the muscles well. Another example is the famous marble sarcophagus from Sidon, named the Alexander sarcophagus. Historians claim that this work was created in the late 4th century BC. The long sides of the sarcophagus are decorated with reliefs depicting the battle of Alexander the Great's army with the Persians. The large composition consists of figures in full motion, very convincingly conveying the heat of the battle. The figures depicted on the sarcophagus have been very well preserved. Only the details made of metal and some parts of the warriors' weapons have been lost.
And here we see that the human figures are made in exact accordance with anatomy. When you look at these sculptures, the question involuntarily arises:
If even in the 15th century artists still did not know the location of musculature, then where did this knowledge come from in earlier times? Perhaps antiquity was the heyday of not only art, but also medicine. Therefore, ancient sculptors could easily have studied the structure of the human body. But why then was this knowledge subsequently lost? Most likely, all these supposedly ancient monuments were not made before the Common Era, but in the era of the Reformation, when the Scaligerian version of history was being actively introduced. Moreover, they were made in just a few European workshops. At this time, the release of the new history textbooks began, which had to be supplemented with visual aids on the beautiful antiquity. This seems complicated only at first glance, because the number of truly outstanding ancient works is not so great.
They could easily have been made in a few decades.
During the Renaissance, there were sculptors who literally specialized in such forgeries. One of them even earned the nickname Antico, which means ancient. Even the great Michelangelo became known thanks to a forgery. A young and unknown Michelangelo created the Sleeping Cupid statue, and a certain Baldassare del Milanese suggested reselling it as an antique original. The deal went well, and the statuette gained great fame. The forgery was soon discovered, but Michelangelo arrived in Rome already as a celebrity, a sculptor who had, so to speak, risen to the mastery of supposed ancient sculptors. It was during this period that the young man received his first major orders. In 1864, the antiquities collector Denali Vo brought an ancient bust of the poet Girolamo Benivieni from Florence. The bust was sold at auction for a fortune and ended up in the Louvre. But in 1867, it was discovered that the sculptor Giovanni Bastianini was actually the author of the bust. A huge scandal erupted, especially among professionals who were outraged. As a result, the sculpture was transferred to the Decorative Arts Department. The author of a whole series of antiques, so-called products of the ancient era, was the sculptor Israel Ruahomovsky. But he gained worldwide fame for the tiara of Cytopharnes, which in 1895 he sold to the Louvre as an authentic Greek artifact dating back to the 3rd century BC. The French paid Ruahomovsky 200,000 francs for this forgery. When it was revealed that the figures on the tiara had been copied from drawings in a cultural history atlas, Ruahomovsky claimed authorship. However, experts at the museum refused to believe him until he presented his series of antiques. After this scandal, the Louvre management ordered the crown to be placed in the modern Decorative Arts Department. Unfortunately, this was not the only forgery purchased by the Louvre. In 1939, the museum acquired a supposed ancient Scythian drinking horn. However, the Historical Museum in Moscow had already purchased the same horn in 1908. Both of these items came from the workshop of the Gochman brothers in Ochakov. They ran a firm that produced such forgeries on commission for jewelers. The firm's clients included museums in Russia, Germany, France, England, Greece, and Italy. They created a network of figureheads. For example, a certain peasant woman named Ann Yuta from the village of Perutino often visited museums, offering to sell her antiques. At the same time, she very convincingly and in great detail described how and where she found these items. And one collector was even given the opportunity by the Gochman firm to make a find himself. Digging up an ancient burial site, the collector supposedly stumbled upon a unique ancient artifact.
In reality, of course, it was a fake that the Gokman brothers had planted in the tomb in advance.
But the famous Alceo da Sena was considered the king of ancient falsification. He was a brilliant forger who made so-called Athenian statues in the antique style, sculptures in the Gothic style, marble sarcophagi, and figurines dating back 3,000 years. His workshop flooded the world market with fake antiques for many years. In private collections and museums in Europe and America, sculptures created in da Sena's workshop could be found. They were considered the works of Donatello, Verrocchio, da Fiesole, Rossellino, and other luminaries of the Renaissance era.
In 1927, da Sena came forward and exposed himself.
Needless to say, he was not believed. The last of the non-believers were convinced by a film made in da Sena's workshop. In front of the camera, the sculptor calmly created his final, this time legal forgery, an antique statue of a goddess. However, very often museums are not interested in impartial investigation of so-called ancient finds and refuse to listen to the candid confessions of fraudsters. The work of forgers can be found not only within the walls of museums but also in ancient temples. One of the most scandalous falsifications in recent times was the forgery of frescoes in the Hospital of the Holy Spirit and in the Church of St. Mary in the German city of Lübeck. Due to the bombings in 1942, part of the plaster in the church collapsed. Underneath it, a painting from the 13th century was revealed. After the war, in 1948, they decided to restore the frescoes, inviting a certain Dietrich Fay as a restorer. It was a rather strange choice because Fay had previously been convicted of forging works of art. This restorer also enlisted the help of Lothar Malskit, also a major specialist in forgery. After the restoration was completed, Fay and Malskit announced that they had managed to uncover ancient paintings on the walls of the church choir, hidden by later layers. After 3 years of work, on the 700th anniversary of Lübeck, the restored church and hospital were triumphantly opened. A postage stamp was even issued to commemorate the event. These frescoes would still probably have been considered authentic if the city authorities had rewarded both restorers for their work. But only Dietrich Fay received a reward, and Malskit received nothing. He was greatly offended and confessed that at Fay's order, he had knocked down the 13th century frescoes and painted new ones based on preserved photographs. A special commission examined the frescoes and declared that Malskit was lying. Then the virtuoso restorer asked the members of the commission to look more closely at the faces of the saints. The commission looked and gasped in awe. The saints had the faces of Genghis Khan, Rasputin, Marlene Dietrich, and even Malskat's own sister. The scandal grew, and the commission discovered other masterpieces of the restorers. In particular, fake frescoes in the Church of St. Catherine in the same Lübeck. By the way, it turned out that Malskit did not even knock down the ancient frescoes, but painted directly on them. Unfortunately, it was not possible to restore the 13th century painting afterward. In the history of architecture, not only is material forgery often encountered, but also chronological forgery. Historians deliberately increase the age of some ancient buildings by hundreds of years. A typical example of this is the Cologne Cathedral. In addition to its magnificent architecture, it is known for the fact that the remains of the three wise men, also known as the Magi, who were the first to come to worship the newborn Jesus and the Virgin Mary, are kept here in a special shrine. The construction of the cathedral was believed to have begun in 1248. Historians even give the exact date, August 15, 1248. Presumably, the construction of the cathedral lasted more than 300 years and was completed around 1560. In publications about the history of the Cologne Cathedral, it is written that after the 16th century, the cathedral was only partially restored, but in general its appearance hardly changed. However, this statement by historians, to put it mildly, does not correspond to reality. This is the plan of the Cologne Cathedral, presented in a brochure that can be obtained from the church staff.
It clearly shows which parts of it were built in the Middle Ages and which in the 19th and even 20th centuries.
The author of the brochure is Professor Arnold Wolff. So, the oldest masonry, as historians claim, from the period of 1248 to 1560, is shown on the diagram with horizontal hatching. Here it is.
Remarkable.
But the oldest medieval masonry makes up only a small part of the modern building, about half of the cathedral's foundation. And all the other masonry was made after 1826. It turns out that the cathedral we see today was actually built entirely in the 19th century.
And the Scaliger history assures us that before our eyes is a medieval church.
But on what basis? Are there any authentic medieval images of the Cologne Cathedral? Arnold Wolff's brochure contains only an 1836 engraving. Most likely, the construction of the Cologne Cathedral began around 1825 and was completed in the 1830s. That is, it was built for about 10 years. The artist depicted the last stage of the creation of the cathedral in the engraving of 1836. Then the cathedral was restored and even rebuilt several times, but its appearance hardly changed. However, there was some ancient building on this site. It is evident on the diagram that this medieval masonry was used, including for the construction of the 19th century cathedral. The lower part of the left tower is laid with stones from the 19th century, and stones from the 13th–16th centuries are laid between them. And the upper half of this tower, as well as the second tower, by the way, was entirely built in the 19th century. This means that in the 19th century, the medieval structure located on the site of the modern Cologne Cathedral was dismantled, and its material was used for the construction of a practically new building. By the way, it is completely unclear how modern archaeologists date the fragments of medieval masonry, how they determined that these stones were laid in 1248, and these ones in 1560. There is no evidence for such dating. It is possible that these stones were laid here in the 17th or even the 18th century. In general, the age of a building cannot be judged by its appearance. While traveling the world and exploring landmarks of different countries, we should not believe everything that tour guides tell us. The rehearsed stories they repeat day after day are often unfounded and lack documentary evidence.
The history of many so-called ancient monuments cannot be traced back beyond the 18th century AD.
Some of them continue to be built even today, right in front of tourists. And then the guides will tell them that these walls are hundreds, or even thousands, of years old. After all, the structure looks so old. In Crimea, there are caves with a lot of natural stone that locals have always used for construction needs.
And today, you can see piles of stones prepared by someone for construction or restoration work.
Externally, this stone looks very old. If this wall is to be completed nonetheless, then after some time, tour guides will be able to show it to unsuspecting tourists as a structure from, for example, the 16th century. This is the coast of the Dead Sea.
The ruins of the Qumran settlement, which historians date back to the 8th–6th centuries BC.
Obviously, the ancient builders did not leave any plaques indicating the founding of this settlement. Therefore, archaeologists and historians, as always, themselves determined the age of the finds. When you look at the ruins up close, it is clear that the cement binding the stones was laid quite recently. It is mainly painted in terracotta for some reason, but in some places they didn't even bother to paint it.
And these neat notches made when laying the cement, we apparently should take for ancient chips and cracks.
Perhaps somewhere archaeologists have irrefutable evidence that these buildings were built 10 centuries ago. But what is on display for all to see looks more like a decoration than an ancient settlement. As a rule, when visiting a particular country, tourists visit at least one museum there. Without visiting the National Historical or Archaeological Museum, you feel as though you haven't really touched the ancient history of that state. And everything is neatly arranged and labeled in museums. A few photos and you can take a piece of antiquity with you. However, few people think about the number of forgeries that are stored in the archaeological collections of museums in different countries. Here are just a few examples. At the end of the 19th century, an assortment of Moabite figurines decorated with dots and seemingly meaningless inscriptions appeared in Jerusalem. The lot consisted of 1,700 objects. Upon the advice of experts, the Prussian government bought these figurines for 20,000 thalers. However, the French Orientalist Clermont-Ganneau, who had long served in the French mission in Jerusalem, declared the figurines to be forgeries. A political scandal erupted, as the collection of Moabite culture became an adornment of the Berlin Museum. But it turned out that Clermont-Ganneau was right. All these so-called antiquities were made by a company located in Jerusalem. The production of the fakes was supervised by the icon painter Selim. In 1937, a certain Ghanan, plowing a field near Brizet, found a marble statue of Venus. The opinion of experts was unanimous.
Venus was made in the 1st century BC.
Only they could not determine the author, either Praxiteles or Phidias. Ghanan received 250,000 for this ancient creation. And in 1938, the sculptor François Crémenes claimed that he had buried the statue of his own making in the field 2 years ago. The evidence is the missing fragments. The purpose of the forgery was to show what he was capable of. A special place in the series of archaeological forgeries is occupied by forgeries of objects from the biblical period. As we showed in our film Forgotten Jerusalem, the main support for historians in the study of biblical antiquities is the science called biblical archaeology. But this science is quite peculiar.
Its main purpose is to search for and study artifacts related to the events described in the Bible.
Despite the huge number of finds made on the territory of modern Israel, historians have not received irrefutable evidence that ancient Judea was located precisely here. That modern Jerusalem is exactly the city described in the Bible. Historians have no indisputable evidence that the age of Jerusalem is indeed several thousand years.
On the contrary, Jerusalem guidebooks say that the buildings of the Old City were built no earlier than the 14th century AD.
As for the sensational biblical finds made in these territories, they often cause problems and even scandals. Israeli courts periodically hear cases of falsified artifacts. As a rule, items that fall under suspicion are recognized as forgeries. These are not only well-known and high-profile forgeries such as the King Solomon's Tablet of Stone or the James Ossuary. Numerous counterfeit seals, coins, and figurines have been discovered that became museum exhibits. But in addition to both exposed and still unexposed forgeries, museums around the world store many items that historians modestly call copies. These copies are allegedly made from lost originals for various reasons. Museum visitors have no way to verify what is displayed in these showcases: genuine articles, copies, or outright forgeries. They have to take the word of historians and tour guides. Throughout history, not only secular items have been frequently falsified but sacred objects as well. In the Middle Ages, people were ignorant and didn't travel a lot. In the best case, they only knew by hearsay about the holy relics kept in other lands and countries. But at the same time, they were devout and did not doubt the authenticity of the relics. And that is what the fraudsters took advantage of. The strongest emotions for believing Christians are caused by relics associated with Jesus Christ, including fragments of the true cross. It is believed that together with other relics, pieces of the Holy Cross were brought by crusaders who returned from their campaign to Constantinople. Today, there are so many of these fragments scattered around the world that if they were all put together, it would be possible to assemble not one, but several crosses. Throughout history, people have held a special reverence for the remains of holy martyrs and righteous men. And in ancient times as well as today, there have been many cases of believers being healed after worshipping the holy relics. But, unfortunately, among genuine relics, there were also forgeries. Fraudsters have never been afraid to offend people's religious feelings. But forgers produced fakes not only of Christian relics. In the late 1970s, French archaeologist André Lemaire discovered in one of the antique shops an object of a religious cult, which was supposedly used in the Temple of King Solomon in Jerusalem. It was a pomegranate fruit carved from ivory. Scientists assumed that the bone pomegranate was used as the top of a scepter carried by the temple priest. This was evidenced by the inscription on it in ancient Hebrew, "Holy to the priest of the house of God." Historians dated this object to the 8th century BC. The pomegranate passed from one owner to another until it was acquired by the Israeli Museum in 1988. This item was considered a very fortunate acquisition, as it was believed to be the only item remaining from the first temple. Perhaps the bone pomegranate would still be considered authentic if not for the results of the work of the Investigative Committee of Israel and the country's police, who exposed the forgers of antiquities. For several months, art experts carefully studied the exhibit using the latest technology and concluded that it was a fake. To date, the list of various religious forgeries is quite long, and, unfortunately, it continues to grow. It is well known that in the ancient historical centers of coin minting, workshops producing counterfeit coins subsequently emerged, minting coins common to the region. Today, thousands of such counterfeits are known. For example, in the 16th century, the firm of the Italian Giovanni Covino released a large number of counterfeit ancient coins onto the market. After he was exposed, it was revealed that entire series of these counterfeits were stored in various museums around the world. And in the 19th century, a counterfeiter who lived in Germany made 622 stamps used to mint counterfeit Roman aurei and denarii. These counterfeits littered many museum collections until the beginning of the 20th century.
For over 200 years, the study of coins and the identification of fakes has been the domain of the science of numismatics.
Compared to other sciences, numismatics was formed relatively late, in the late 18th century. By this time, the Scaligerian chronology had already been finalized and established. Therefore, it is quite understandable that numismatics rests on the traditional version of history and is intended to documentarily confirm it. Although this is quite difficult to do, as the dating of coin minting is quite rare. For example, dates appear on Russian coins only in 1596. And they were indicated not by numbers, but by Slavic letters. And dates on ancient coins are generally an exceptional case. Therefore, specialists mainly date ancient coins based on indirect signs, such as the personalities depicted on them or their affiliation with a particular state. Over the 200 years of the existence of numismatics as a science, enormous catalogues have been compiled with detailed descriptions of coins from different countries and eras. Therefore, today, when determining the age of each found coin, archaeologists necessarily use these catalogues. They find coins in the catalog that are similar in description and date the found coin to the same era as the coin from the catalog. There is no absolute method for dating coins. Specialists claim that there were several periods in the history of coins. First, there was supposedly an ancient heyday, then for some reason, the Dark Ages of medieval period set in. From the 8th to the 13th century, the regular issuance of gold coins allegedly completely ceased throughout Western Europe. Then this period was replaced by the splendid flowering of the Renaissance. However, after the brilliant period of the Roman Empire of the first 6th centuries AD, the stagnation in Roman coinage, which lasted almost 6 centuries, looks quite strange. Another fact is also surprising. Antique gold coins do not differ in quality and intricacy from similar coins of the 13th–17th centuries. It creates the impression that all the so-called antique coins of Western Europe were minted after the 15th century AD, and then thrown by the Scaligerian chronology back into the distant past. The fact that antique coins were minted no earlier than the 13th century AD is evidenced by another aspect. Most of the known allegedly antique coins are unique coins, that is, existing only as a single example. But for the monetary system of any state, unique coins are absurd. Money should be widespread. Otherwise, it makes no sense. Making individual examples is only profitable for counterfeiters because a large number of identical coins reduces their collectible value and increases the risk of the counterfeiter being exposed. Naturally, a unique coin is the dream of any numismatist. But in private and museum collections, individual copies are so common that one gets the impression that in ancient times, coins were deliberately minted in single copies to satisfy the demands of collectors of future centuries. And instead of acknowledging that the majority of these supposedly ancient coins were counterfeit, historians came up with a rather original explanation for their appearance. It turns out that in ancient times, anyone who feels like it could mint coins. For example, historians claim that the philosopher Pythagoras and the moralist Joshua ben Sirach supposedly minted their own coins at the market, using different stamps. How to otherwise explain that the earliest European treasure troves, containing a large number of identical coins, are dated by historians to the reign of Charlemagne, and this is in the 8th–9th century AD, even according to the Scaligerian chronology. In traditional history, it is not only the development of coin minting in Western Europe that looks strange. The same can be said for Russian coins. The quality of gold and silver coins supposedly from the 10th–11th centuries is simply magnificent. The details are beautifully drawn, the shape is correct, and they are well preserved. The coins of Svyatopolk are slightly worse preserved, but the quality of minting is still beyond praise. Coins from the next period of Russian history, during the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, are also beautifully made. It is believed that the mastery of Yaroslav's silver coin stamps is a phenomenon in 11th century European coin production. In Scaliger's chronology, this phenomenon appears suddenly, like a flash, and seemingly out of nowhere. Coin minting begins immediately at the highest level. But where are the preceding coins? The first samples, rough and primitive, from which coin production should have started. They are somehow missing. But what is most surprising is that after supposedly a brief, brilliant rise, coin minting suddenly stops. Historians explain this by the fact that the population of Russia regressed to a primitive way of life. The Russian people supposedly abandoned commodity money relations and returned to natural exchange. This led to a so-called coinless period, which lasted for about 300 years. In the 14th century, coinage began again in Russia. But these were somehow rough and primitive coins, called wire money. All of them were small, of irregular shape, and made from rough silver scraps. It is quite obvious that skewed dyes were used in their production. The stamp struck the edge of the ingot, and only a few letters were imprinted on it. Therefore, the quality of coinage was very primitive. Only among the coins of the 17th century, issued under Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, do specimens of good quality begin to appear again. But even at that time, there was still a lot of wire money. In terms of quality, they differed little from the wire money from the time of Dmitry Donskoy. Despite the fact that historians come up with different reasons for the cessation of coinage, there was probably no coinless period in Russia or Western Europe. In fact, these primitive stampings were the first coins. The art of coinage, like any other art, developed gradually and only over time reached perfection. Most likely, Russian coins began to be minted no earlier than the 14th century. And before that, if coins were minted in Russia, they were very rough and primitive. In this respect, Russia did not stand out among other states. In Europe, mass coinage also began around the 14th–15th centuries. It is known that throughout history, forgers have been involved in creating not only counterfeit masterpieces. The manufacture of cheap fakes has been thriving for a long time. But the boom in producing cheap fakes began in the late 19th century. At that time, there was a fascination with tourism. A stream of Americans flooded into Europe and Asia, buying up anything they could get their hands on. This American craze for collecting was even reflected in the works of O. Henry and Mark Twain. Money flowed from tourists' wallets into the pockets of various swindlers. Today, it is impossible to determine how many fake ancient papyri, coins, stone figurines, and clay jars were sold, and how many of them are still stored in the collections of deceived antique seekers. Not only ordinary travelers, but also experts, could not always distinguish genuine antiquity from forgery. Once, the German art historian Julius Meyer-Grafe was examining local attractions in Egypt. Together with his guide, he found what he thought was an ancient statuette in the sand. Returning to his hotel, he decided to show his find to a nearby merchant. The merchant invited him in and showed him several statuettes which were exactly the same. The owner of the shop had received them from a commercial agent in Cairo. It turned out that these statuettes were made in Silesia, in the town of Bunzlau. And the local guide who accompanied the art historian had long been specializing in such pseudo-findings. However, not only 100 years ago, but even today, resourceful locals can perform an old trick in front of tourists. For example, digging up at the foot of the pyramids an ancient Egyptian figurine or some other item, supposedly preserved from the time of the pharaohs, and selling it as a unique find then and there.
In the 1920s, such archaeological finds were being cranked out all over Europe. Today it's somewhere in China.
Not only visitors to the pyramids in Giza, but also tourists who have visited other places, such as Pompeii or Rome, can tell similar stories. And even for those who do not believe in the authenticity of supposedly ancient finds, the scammers have another trick up their sleeve. A skeptical tourist may unexpectedly find an ancient Roman coin that supposedly rolled into a crevice between the stones of the Colosseum 2,000 years ago and lay there until today. Unfortunately, today the number of fakes in the world is so great that no one can be sure the authenticity of their purchase. Neither the tourist, buying a supposedly genuine Egyptian papyrus for a pittance, nor the collector who accidentally found an ancient rarity in a small antique shop, nor the professional art expert acquiring an exhibit that has passed numerous expert examinations for one of the largest museums. A forgery may turn out to be not only in an Arab trader's shop, but even at an auction at the world-renowned London firm Sotheby's. Today, there are many methods that specialists use to determine the authenticity and age of historical monuments and archaeological artifacts. However, unfortunately, none of them are absolute or universal. Moreover, very often the assessment of the authenticity of these objects is based on extremely subjective opinions of researchers and experts. This has often led to catastrophic errors. After all, forgeries are often introduced unnoticed into life, and if a forgery is not exposed during the lifetime of one generation, then over time it becomes an original, because for posterity it has already been consecrated by time and the authority of previous owners. Today, not everyone knows that falsifiers of history have falsified not only sculptures, coins, or documents. Forgeries can also be found among famous architectural and archaeological monuments. Some of them have even been declared World Heritage Sites by UNESCO. Watch our next film, 3 Great Forgeries, to learn more.